All right, so you've sent in some really interesting stuff about AI being used to actually diagnose medical conditions.
Yeah.
And you specifically pointed us to colorectal cancer,
Yeah.
which is a pretty fascinating area. We've got this research paper here all about a new approach
Right.
called DeepCon, and it uses these like microscopic images of tissue. It's called histopathology.
uh
And pathologists look at these slides to figure out if someone has cancer.
Exactly.
But this DeepCon thing is using AI to do the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. It's a really, really important area because colorectal cancer, it's a huge global health problem still.
It's scary stuff.
It is. Yeah, the stats are pretty alarming, actually. So in 2020, it was the second leading cause of cancer deaths globally.
Wow.
Over 1.4 million new cases diagnosed and almost 700,000 deaths.
Gosh.
Yeah. So being able to diagnose it early and accurately, that's just crucial for people to have better outcomes and so doctors can decide the right treatment.
Absolutely. I mean, catching it early is everything, right?
Yeah, it makes a huge difference.
So what we want to do in this deep dive is really understand this DeepCon model. Like, how does it actually work? What makes it different from other AI techniques out there?
Okay.
And why is everyone saying it's so accurate?
Right.
Because if it really is that good,
Yeah.
then that's a big deal for patients, for the whole medical community, really.
It would be a game changer for sure.
So we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of this research paper and see how it fits into this whole world of AI and medical imaging.
All right.
But before we go there, I think it's worth talking about why diagnosing CRC from these histopathology images, like, why is that such a difficult thing in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good point.
For a human to do, I mean,
Right. Well, it takes a really trained eye to analyze these images, right? It's
Yeah.
not something just anyone can do. You need pathologists who are
you
experts.
spent years studying this stuff.
Exactly. They spent years studying this stuff, and they can see these subtle but really important abnormalities in the tissue.
Tiny little differences.
Tiny little things. And this process takes time, obviously.
Yeah.
And like with any human assessment, there's always a bit of variability in interpretation, right?
Two different doctors might see things slightly differently.
Exactly. And that's where deep learning comes in. It offers a really promising solution.
The machines are taking over.
Well, maybe not taking over, but definitely helping out. So CNNs in particular.
CNNs.
Yeah, convolutional neural networks, those have shown they're really good at learning and extracting those features from images automatically.
When you say they're good at extracting features from images, what does that actually mean?
It means they can learn to see.
The AI can see.
Yeah, you can think of it that way, like they're learning to see the patterns that separate healthy tissue from cancerous tissue.
It's picking up on things that maybe even a trained human eye could miss.
Possibly.
That's amazing. So CNNs are like the rock stars of image recognition these days, right?
Yeah, they're really powerful.
But one thing that you've talked about before is that when it comes to medical imaging, a big problem is often just the lack of data. Like there isn't enough of it. So why is that such a big problem here specifically?
Well, because in a lot of areas of medical imaging, and this includes CRC histopathology, getting these large data sets that are labeled accurately, it's a big obstacle.
I see.
So you need to collect the tissue samples, prepare them for analysis, and then you need expert pathologists to look at them
Yeah.
and identify and categorize the different types of tissue and
Yeah.
if there's any cancer. And that takes a lot of time and money.
That's a lot of manual work.
It is, yeah, and it's expensive. And because of that, you have a limited amount of good data to train these deep learning models on.
So it's like you're trying to teach a kid how to ride a bike,
Yeah.
but you only let them practice for 5 minutes.
Right. They're not going to get very good, are they?
Exactly. So how do you actually get these sophisticated AI models to learn effectively if you don't have mountains of data?
Well, that's where transfer learning comes in. And this is something the DeepCon paper talks about right at the beginning.
Okay, so remind me, what is transfer learning again?
So transfer learning is a pretty clever technique.
It sounds fancy.
It is pretty fancy. It's where you take a model that's already been trained on a massive general image data set.
Yeah.
Like ImageNet, for example, that's got millions of everyday images.
Like pictures of cats and dogs and
Yeah, exactly. Cats, dogs, houses, trees, all sorts of things.
everything,
And then you apply that knowledge to a new, small, more specific task.
which in this case is.
In our case, it's classifying those CRC histopathology images.
Gotcha.
So the idea is that the model has already learned to recognize basic visual features like edges, textures, shapes.
It's the building blocks of any image.
Exactly, and those are relevant across lots of different types of images.
Makes sense.
So instead of starting from scratch with our medical images, we can fine-tune these pre-trained models using our smaller medical data set.
So it's like you're giving the AI a head start.
Yeah, exactly. It's like saying, okay, you already know the basics, now let's focus on the specifics.
Okay, that's a really helpful way to think about it. So now let's get to the heart of it. How does DeepCon use deep learning and transfer learning
Okay.
for this specific challenge of diagnosing CRC?
So this is where it gets really interesting. DeepCon uses a new approach they call divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah, it's not just taking a pre-trained model and applying it directly to those CRC images.
So it's doing something more clever.
It's doing something more clever, yeah. It breaks down the problem into smaller chunks before putting them back together in a smart way.
Interesting. So it's almost like a strategy.
It is a strategy, yeah.
Right.
And the research paper says DeepCon builds on an earlier model called DTRAC,
D-track.
but they made a key improvement in how it conquers the classification part.
Okay. I'm intrigued. No, tell me more about this dividing and conquering.
All right, so the divide part, or decomposition, that involves taking the original 8 classes of CRC images that pathologists usually look for.
Okay.
So things like tumor, stroma, mucosa,
Uh-huh.
and a few other. And then DeepCon uses a few steps. It extracts important features from these images using a pre-trained network. They often use exception.
Okay.
After that, it applies something called principal component analysis, or PCA.
PCA.
Now, think of PCA as a way to simplify a bunch of features down to the most important ones.
It's like taking a really long, complicated book
Yeah,
and summarizing it to the main points.
that's a great analogy. And then after PCA, they use k-means clustering.
K-means clustering. That sounds familiar.
It's like if you had a big pile of different candies all mixed up.
Okay.
And k-means clustering is how the AI sorts them into groups based on similarities.
Like color or shape.
Exactly, even though we didn't tell it what those groups should
The
be.
AI figures it out itself.
It does, yeah. So the big goal here is to take each of those original 8 classes
Uh-huh.
and split them into 2 more specific subclasses.
So now we have
So we end up with 16 categories.
16 categories.
A lot.
Wow. It gets pretty detailed.
So what's the point of creating all these extra subclasses? Why not just stick with the original 8? Well, within each of those original categories, there can be a lot of variation.
So even within the tumor category.
Yeah, even within tumor, there are different types of tumors that look different under the microscope.
Interesting.
Right. So by breaking it down into these smaller groups that are more visually similar,
You saying it makes it easier for the AI.
it makes the learning process easier in the beginning.
Okay, so it's like giving the AI smaller bites to chew on.
Exactly. And the paper actually has a figure 3 that shows you visually how the 2 clusters within the stroma class look different.
Oh, cool. So we can actually see the difference.
Yeah, it's pretty clear. And then table 1 shows how they took 5,000 images and spread them across these 16 subclasses.
So they're really putting their data where their mouth is.
They are, yeah. And they specifically say that PCA helps to make those subclasses more uniform.
Okay, so it's all about making the initial learning process super clear for the AI.
Exactly.
So now that we've divided everything up, what happens next? This is where the conquering comes in, right?
So the next stage is called course transfer learning.
Course transfer learning.
In this step, they use another pre-trained CNN, like exception or inception v3.
Those are familiar names.
Yeah, those are the ones that have been trained on ImageNet with all those everyday pictures.
Right.
And they train it to recognize these 16 subclasses.
Okay.
But they only adjust the last few layers of the network because the beginning layers already have that basic visual understanding.
So they're building on what the AI already knows.
That's it. And they use a specific mathematical function called categorical cross-entropy loss to guide this training.
They even gave it an equation number in the paper.
They did. It's equation 5 if you want to look it up.
Okay, so now the model can tell the difference between these 16 really specific categories.
Right.
But we still need to figure out those original 8 tissue types for the diagnosis, right?
You're exactly right. So how does DeepCon bridge that gap? How does it go from 16 back to 8?
Yeah, that's the key question.
And this is a really cool part. This is what they call learned composition.
Learn to composition.
So instead of just mapping those 16 subclasses back to the original 8 using a simple rule, DeepCon adds another transfer learning step.
Another one?
Yep, they take a CNN that's already learned to classify those 16 subclasses.
Like an AI expert at this point.
Yeah, it's gotten really good at those 16.
Right.
And they fine-tune it even further to classify the original 8 classes.
Okay.
And the key is that the knowledge or the weights the network learned during that subclass step are used to help with the original classification.
So it's not forgetting what it learned before.
It's not forgetting, it's using that information. It's
Yeah.
learning not only what the subclasses look like, but also how they relate back to those main categories.
So it's like the AI is learning the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they use that same categorical cross-entropy loss function again.
But this time
This time it's equation 6 with the original class labels.
So it's like it's taking all those tiny details and figuring out how they fit together to make the big diagnosis.
That's a perfect way to put it.
That seems way smarter than just trying to classify those complex images all at once right from the beginning.
That's what the researchers think too. They say all that visual variation within the original classes makes it harder for the model to learn everything in one go.
It gets confused.
Yeah, it gets confused. But by breaking it down into those smaller, consistent groups, the initial learning is more effective.
It can really focus.
Yeah, and then that learn decomposition step lets the model see the connections between those subtle details and the big picture diagnosis.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense, but the real question is, how well does it actually work?
Right.
What kind of results are we talking about here? Because I remember the paper mentioned some pretty impressive numbers.
They did. The results are really amazing. They used the exception network as the base.
Yeah.
And they did what they call deep fine-tuning.
Deep fine-tuning.
And DeepCon got an accuracy of 98.4%.
98.4%.
Wow. And an F1 score of 98.4%
Yeah,
too.
both are super high.
Both super high, yeah.
Yeah.
And they used 5,000 clinically validated CRC images.
Okay, so this is real-world data.
Real-world data. Yeah. So this means it has really strong potential to be accurate in actual clinical use.
That's the kind of accuracy that could actually change how doctors diagnose this.
It could have a huge impact.
So besides the obvious accuracy, what are some other advantages of DeepCon?
Well, they highlight a few things. So first, the accuracy, obviously that's huge.
Yeah.
But second, the subclass classification, it gives doctors more detailed information.
Oh, so it's not just saying yes or no to cancer.
It's going deeper than that.
Right, it's giving more specific insights.
And that could help doctors personalize treatment plans.
Okay, so it's not just about diagnosis, it's about treatment too.
Exactly. And they also say that DeepCon's transfer learning framework is flexible.
What does that mean?
It means it can be adapted to different data sets more easily.
So if you have a new set of images,
Yeah, you don't have to start from scratch.
you can just plug them in.
Pretty much. And finally, they talk about efficient learning, meaning it makes good use of the data it has.
So it's not wasting time.
It's learning quickly and effectively.
Okay, so it sounds like DeepCon is pretty impressive, but it's always good to see how a new method compares to what's already out there.
Absolutely.
And the paper does have a section where they talk about related research.
It does, yeah, it's section 2.
So what kind of context does that give us for DeepCon's advancements?
So it gives you a good overview of all the research happening in AI for CRC histopathology image classification.
Okay.
They talk about different approaches that have been tried, like multitask learning by Peng and his team.
Multitask learning.
Yeah, so that's trying to do classification and image retrieval at the same time.
It's like multitasking.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's Raskowski's work using a Bayesian network.
Bayesian network, I've heard of that.
That's supposed to give more reliable classification.
And then there's...
And then there's Shaban and his group. They used stacked CNNs to look at a wider context within the images.
So they're taking in more information.
They are, yeah. So basically, DeepCon is building on all this existing research. It's not coming out of nowhere.
It's standing on the shoulders of giants.
Exactly.
Now, what about the comparison to DeTrack, the earlier model that DeepCon is, based on how much better is it?
So the paper says DeepCon shows significant improvement over DeTrack.
Significant improvement.
Yeah. So with the exception network, DeepCon was 1.2% more accurate with fine-tuning.
Yeah.
And 0.2% more accurate with deep fine-tuning.
And they showed those numbers in.
They show that in tables 4 and 5.
Okay, so the improvements are small, but they're real.
Yeah, and they even did statistical tests to make sure the improvements were significant.
Which test did they use?
They used something called paired student t-tests.
Fancy.
Yeah, it's a way to make sure the results weren't just due to chance.
So it wasn't just a fluke.
Not a fluke. Yeah, it was a real improvement.
So DeepCon is clearly a step forward, but like all research, it has to have limitations, right?
Right, every study has limitations.
So what are the drawbacks of DeepCon?
So they do mention one potential limitation, and it's a computational cost, meaning it needs a lot of computing power because of that two-stage transfer learning.
Because it's doing all that extra training.
Exactly. First with the subclasses and then with the original classes.
Yeah.
So it needs more power than just a simple one-stage classification.
So it's more accurate.
Yeah.
But it's also more demanding.
That's a good way to put it.
I guess that's a trade-off you have to consider.
Mm.
But if it means more accurate diagnoses, then it might be worth it.
I think so too.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But if you had to summarize it, What's the most important takeaway for our listeners about DeepCon?
Well, the main point is that DeepCon is a really promising step forward in using deep learning for CRC diagnosis.
It's a big deal.
It is, yeah, that divide and conquer strategy is really effective.
Remind me again what's so special about that strategy.
So it's all about breaking down that complex image classification task into smaller pieces, those visually consistent subclasses.
Right.
And then it learns how to put those pieces back together to classify the original categories.
And that leads to
And that leads to really high accuracy rates. They got those amazing results on a real clinical data set, so it's not just theoretical.
it's the real deal.
It's the real deal, yeah.
And, if you can achieve that level of accuracy in the real world, that could be life-changing for people.
Absolutely. It means earlier detection, which means better treatment decisions and hopefully better outcomes for patients.
It could mean the difference between life and death.
It really could, and not just survival, but quality of life too.
Exactly. Because if you can catch it early,
Yeah,
you might not need such aggressive treatment.
exactly. And DeepCon could even give doctors more specific information so they can personalize treatment plans.
So it's like a double win.
It is, yeah. It's really exciting to see how AI is evolving to tackle these really tough medical problems.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is, yeah.
And it makes you wonder, could this divide and conquer strategy be used for other medical problems too?
That's a great question.
Or maybe even outside of medicine?
Yeah, maybe in any field where you have a lot of complex data that's hard to analyze.
Food for thought.
Definitely.
Well, you've just taken a deep dive into one of the most promising approaches to AI in medicine.
Yeah, it's cutting edge stuff.
And there's always more to learn and discover, right?
That's the beauty of science. Always something new on the horizon.
That's right. And we'll be here to explore it all with you.
Absolutely. Until next time.
See you next time.